Welcome to this week's edition of a World Crisis Radio. This is your host, Webster Tarpley, broadcasting from Washington, D.C. Right now, it's the afternoon of December 16th, 2016. And the world crisis is unfolding as people who have been following this broadcast, I think, already know clearly. We are in the midst of a breakdown crisis of world civilization. And the great need is for a philosophical doctrine and indeed a leadership in terms of people who would be able, and means organized people, hopefully, to lead humanity out of this breakdown crisis. And this is the great need. Right? What is it? What new approach to world affairs could be found that would lead people out of the crisis? On National Public Radio this morning, we were given an anecdote that if you're making deals in business, the goal is always clear. It's money. Maybe power, but the goals are pretty clear. But if you're making diplomatic démarches, right, if you're doing diplomatic work, you first have to decide what the goal is. Well, a country like the United States ought to have a clear goal. That is to say, to promote peace, progress, and prosperity in the world. Or, as de Gaulle put it, independence, peace, and prosperity. Those combinations, these are eminently similar. So you ought to know your goal, and therefore you shouldn't have to invent a goal every time. And the problem, of course, of U.S. foreign policy on all the big sides, right, all of the prominent sides, is that there is no obvious goal except, aggrandizement, right, this crude greed, power, geopolitics, right? The infinite wiles and meanderings of geopolitics. So we are today in such a breakdown crisis, and the commitment we make here is that in 2017, which will soon be upon us, we here will do everything possible to elaborate and put forward a doctrine, a philosophical approach, methods, programs, and similar means to try to pursue an exit from this world crisis, which has gone on altogether too far and which has reached altogether too deeply. So let's start with the largely good news, not unalloyed good news, but certainly substantially good news, which is the end of rebel resistance in Aleppo, Syria, except, of course, for the necessary mopping up. There are, I think, diehards, desperados, kamikazes, jihadis, suiciders left in Aleppo who would like to use this situation to wreak more execution on anybody they can find, really, whether it's the population of Aleppo or the Syrian Arab army or whatever else it is. So the word we now have is that for the moment, the convoys, the humanitarian convoys organized by the International Committee of the Red Cross, those have been suspended once again. And the way this has proceeded would seem to be something like this. As of today, we were told that there were 6, 7, or 8 convoys that left the city today. Right? These are scores of vehicles in each convoy, and that these were heading towards rebel territory. Right? Rebel territory, Idlib. Now, this is already a very dubious decision. Why take these poor, suffering people and then put them back under the armed sway of the jihadis, right, of the crazies? because that's who controls Idlib. In other words, we're told that the rebels, the terrorist rebels that are holding Idlib, are worse than the terrorist rebels holding Aleppo. The ones in Aleppo, of course, bad enough, but perhaps with a greater secular camouflage. But the ones in Idlib are the full jihadi mix. So these poor people, 6, 7, or 8 convoys, were on their way to Idlib. And you'll remember that there's rebel territory not that far outside of Aleppo, right? They've been held at bay. However, at some point, there are different stories now. One story is that somebody opened fire on one of these convoys. That's one version. Now that again reeks, according to the cui bono analysis principle, that reeks of terrorist rebels, right? Because they're the ones who have everything to gain by prolonging the agony, and perhaps they're still betting on this worldwide campaign of hysteria that we have to, quote, do something or intervene somehow. And, of course, any way you slice it, that means, or do more. Do more was another one we heard today. Do more means bomb Assad. And, of course, the idea of a safe zone or a no-fly zone means many weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, but maybe a month, depending on the strength of the Syrian anti-aircraft resistance, if it were only that. That's what they mean. So don't listen to the crocodile tears. Don't listen to the humanitarian bombers. They're coming to you with a sob story. They've got pictures of children. Well, what is it you want? First, they won't tell you, but if you really insist, they'll say, well, of course, we've got to bomb Assad. And once again, that leads to the caliphate from the Mediterranean coast at the St. George's Hotel in Lebanon, all the way deep into Mesopotamia, all the way to Baghdad and beyond. So don't do it. It's clear to me Obama's not doing it. Obama has just, or is now, as we record, still holding his last press conference of the year. And Obama's on his way to Hawaii, and therefore I don't think he's going to commit the supreme folly of doing anything more militarily than he's doing in that area. The time for that has passed. The military solution is upon us. So after the 6 or 7 or 8 convoys were allowed to leave, right, got out and got back into rebel territory so that apparently they would not be interfered with there. This is all very dubious, but it is, by the way, it's a result of negotiations of the Russian government with the rebel leaders, the terrorist rebel leaders, the Committee of 300, I guess it is, and that is mediated by Turkey. So you could ask a lot of questions about that, but the Turks say that they are in touch with this other force, right, that perhaps the rest of us, don't see as that separate, right? But that's fine. Let them do it if it gets the people out. Now, we've also got a competing story that the exit of the humanitarian convoys from Aleppo is to be blamed or attributed, depending on where you're standing, to be blamed on certain Shiite militias. Now, these are Iraqi, I think, or some partially Iraqi Shiite militias, which have shown up at Aleppo to fight the terrorist rebels under the auspices of Iran. So these are called pro-Iranian Shiite militias, I guess. Some of them of foreign origin, Iraqi origin. But it's important. They have been invited by the legal Syrian government. That's the big difference. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. And let me remind you, if you want to get this analysis 4 additional days per week, we have our Monday through Thursday program, The American System. And the American System is available at americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. And you can go there and become a subscriber, token fee. And, of course, if you want to support our activism, you can do that too, and I'd be very grateful. This is the best way to support my work, so please go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Now, we've said one explanation is that the convoys were stopped because of the actions of this pro-Iranian Shiite militia. What was the issue? They said they stopped a convoy. There are accusations that the Iranian Shiite militia executed a couple of people who were on one of these buses. Those could have been jihadis that they had been encountering during the fighting. I don't know. But especially the demand made by the Iranian Shiite militias was for the lifting of the siege. You know, if you're letting all these people out of Aleppo after a siege, then they said we would like a quid pro quo, and the quid pro quo would be that there are two Shiite villages which have been for several years besieged by the jihadis, by the terrorist rebels, by Al-Qaeda, to put it bluntly. And they said they would like the siege of those places lifted also, so that maybe those guys could get out, or whatever solution appeared most convenient to these Shiite militias. So that's another version. Again, my money is on the firing, the shooting at one of the convoys by the classic terrorist rebels, right? Moderate terrorists that unfortunately the Western powers have been supporting. There's another version that said at a certain point a Russian military officer showed up and said, we're stopping the convoy. So they ordered a halt with no reason. Now, the next round, this question of the humanitarian bombers, the crocodile criers, right, the crocodile weepers. The crocodile weepers are now getting ready for Idlib. In other words, when the bulk of these refugees, wounded, and terrorist fighters, and the families of terrorist fighters, I guess, when they go to Idlib, that will be another chapter. Militarily, I think the die is cast, right? The terrorist rebels are defeated. They will continue to be defeated unless and until something crazy comes in from the outside, and in this world we don't know. So there will now be a hue and cry, a brouhaha about the terrible humanitarian conditions in Idlib. So my question is, if it's so terrible, why don't those rebels just surrender under UN auspices, right? Get some UN officials in there, get some observers, some monitors, surrender and leave, or leave without even surrendering, right? Exfiltrate yourself at night. The rebels right now are increasingly isolated. Many powers around the world. The U.S. is obviously not going to start World War III for a bunch of terrorist rebels. We're told, and it's kind of a means to try to goad the West in some way into some sort of action. Right? We're told that the word in the Middle East is Putin won. Putin is the winner of this. Yeah, fine. You win a few, you lose a few. It's not the end of the world anyway. And if Russia has had the merit of contributing to the end of this, as I've said repeatedly, the only mercy of warfare is when it ends. So if you can end it, that is in itself a humanitarian act, I think, under most circumstances anyway. Nevertheless, today, on the last episode, the last Friday news roundup, the domestic hour and the international hour, with Diane Rehm, who is now retiring. She had to besmirch her final program with quotes from Samantha Power, this posturing statement, right, this acme of, or nadir of hypocrisy, where Samantha Power says, have you no shame? Is there nothing that will creep you out? Says Samantha. Again, the departure of Samantha Power will be one of the consolations, let's say, of early 2017, and the fact that she won't be the Secretary of State, right? This loopy lady who has always been regarded with suspicion by the military because she wants to weaponize human rights and then draw the most extreme consequences. So we also had to hear a repetition of the Ghouta chemical warfare myth. We had to hear about the need to arm the Syrian terrorist rebels. Yes, let's give them surface-to-air missiles, and then those show up outside Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, or JFK, or Fiumicino, or Frankfurt Airport, whatever it is. That'll be fine. Heathrow will be on the receiving end if you do that. Right? So good that was not done on such a large scale. We are also told here that Putin, for his part, right, and the Russian government is actually negotiating, as we say, with the rebels. Putin has been in Japan, meeting with Abe, the Japanese prime minister, and Putin has said that he would like to see a negotiation involving Russia, Turkey, and on the one hand, and Russia and Turkey along with the Syrian rebels and the Syrian government, and that he would like this to occur in Kazakhstan. Notice this is not the Geneva process. The U.S. is not invited. NATO is not invited, and so forth. And the question is, Putin, are you trying to make that the replacement for the Geneva process, which has been going and could now be revived? Should now, in my view, should be revived. He said, no, or the Russian foreign ministry says, no, that is simply a supplement. It's in addition to the Geneva process. So I think that brings us up to date on Aleppo. It's essentially a ghost town, and the people that are there, some of them are this stay-behind operation of the terrorist rebels. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio in Washington, D.C., reminding you to check out AmericanSystem.tv. There we have kinds of background analysis. For example, the question of whether we're witnessing a new phase, a new ratchet down into the age of oligarchy. And we're getting, to some degree, according to some, a convergence of certain parts of the U.S. financier oligarchy converging with the current representatives of the Russian nomenklatura, the Russian version of oligarchy. And, of course, don't forget the princelings, the Chinese Communist Party's princeling generation, which still, of course, exercises inordinate power in China. Not to mention the Eurogarchs, right? The Eurogarchs at the European Central Bank and the Brussels Commission. So that kind of in-depth stuff is what we can do day to day, every day, and I invite you to join us. And it costs you, I think, 50 cents per program, right? So I think that it's cheaper than a newspaper, and you end up learning a whole lot more. All right, so a lot of recrimination, right? A lot of whining, a lot of finger pointing. Some of these people, they're getting really bombastic, right? That this is the failure of humanity in our time. That, for example, Aleppo has fallen and so has humanity, says the Canadian National Post. But also from Canada, we have another version, right? Neil MacDonald of the CBC. The fall of Aleppo is not the disgrace of humanity, and there's little the West could have done. Now, that's already a step towards wisdom, that just by bombing Assad, yeah, that's not going to do anything. That's going to give you a much bigger problem. And then when Assad falls, if he does, right, according to this scenario, and ISIS gets to Damascus and ISIS gets to Beirut and so forth, then you're going to have massacres. You're going to have something like the rape of Nanjing in the late 1930s, and then you're going to have huge calls to come in and start bombing. So no. The only thing I would say to the distinguished MacDonald of the CBC is that, yes, there would have been something. It would have been to say to Saudi Arabia, don't you ship those jihadis in there. And, of course, say to the United States, right, to the misguided Hillary Clinton State Department, because they're the ones who did this, right? It was 2011 into 2012. Don't set up a U.S. airlift, say, from Libya to Turkey, and then ship those jihadis into northern Syria, right? Because that's when the problem started with Aleppo. That it was when the forces that had been there up to that point decided to target Aleppo, which had been a flourishing metropolis. Notice that Aleppo is the center of the creation of economic value. It is an industrialized city. It's sort of more like the Chicago or the Detroit of Syria, whereas Damascus is some kind of a combination of New York and Washington, D.C. So we look forward to peace in Syria at some point in 2017. Now, we also, well, this leads us into another problem. The president-elect, speaking yesterday in a rally, said that he continued to support the idea of safe zones for Syria, and this has left many puzzled. What is it that would mean? And, of course, safe zones, no-fly zones, that is a euphemism for a bombing campaign of several weeks, as we were just saying, which would shut down every airport, every military base, every possible anti-aircraft facility. It would be a massive bombing campaign, and there would be losses this time, right? This is not going to be Serbia where you do the whole thing and you get off without even getting nicked. This time you'd be nicked. Of course, since Russia is there, you'd be worse than nicked. I was just talking about the Syrian capabilities, right? But the entire defense could be run through the Syrian capabilities. Let me just add, we're being told now the Russian Reconciliation Center for Syria. Now, this is an interesting group, right? Watch out for the names. The Russian Reconciliation Center for Syria, which is a part of the Russian Ministry of Defense, says that they're demining experts, right? The sappers, as they're called in military parlance, right? The sappers who, the bomb squad, the Hurt Locker guys. Those guys are going back into Aleppo now, and they're beginning to take care of the mines and the booby traps and so forth. And we are also told that 7,000 people have already returned to Aleppo, although to parts that had been liberated, several days or weeks ago in the course of the siege. On France 24, I think it was today, it was pointed out that the Republican president-elect does not seem to have issued any tweets at any point in regard to Aleppo. But the policy he recommended yesterday was a safe zone. And a safe zone, again, that train has left the station. You've got Russia there. You've got S-400 surface-to-air missiles. You've got Russian bases. You've got Russian planes. And only it would be very foolish to try to do anything that would result into a conflict, right? Above all, because there is no U.S. interest at stake. What is it that unites us with these jihadis, right? With these terrorist rebels. Now, the three prongs for 2017, I think, are, no matter what you think is happening with the U.S. and Russia, and I think this is not as promising as it seems. If we look at the putative cabinet, we have to assume that the risk of a conflict with Iran is going to increase rather exponentially. We have General Flynn, who is adamant about his suspicion, mistrust vis-a-vis Iran. We have the candidate for the CIA, Congressman Pompeo, also on the same wavelength. We've got General Mattis. The Marine Corps always goes back to the mid-'70s in Beirut when the Marine barracks was blown up, and their view is that that was done by Hezbollah with collusion from Iran. So there's a grudge there. I think one article describes a 33-year grudge, or probably more, going back to this. And if we got Secretary Bolton back, or Ambassador Bolton, better yet, Ambassador Bolton would be another strong anti-Iranian voice. A lot of Republicans think that the Iran nuclear deal ought to be sabotaged. We ought to assure them that if they do this, nobody will follow them. This will hurt Boeing to the tune of 16 or 17 billion U.S. dollars of future plane sales to Iran, but it won't stop anybody, not Europe, not China, not Russia, from trading with Iran. So war with Iran, I think, is probably the first big thing that we have to be aware of, and try to find ways to facilitate war avoidance. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Now, the other prong, we have three prongs. Iran is the first prong. Another prong would be the relations with China. Now, it's understandable that nobody really wants to submit to the dictates of Beijing in terms of who you meet. This part is understandable. This need not be interpreted as a straitjacket, but at the same time, there are situations of high tension, like the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, right? The narrow seas that naval powers typically try to dominate. And what do we have today? We have, according to Reuters, the Chinese Navy has seized an underwater drone deployed by a U.S. military oceanographic vessel in the South China Sea. So this is it's an underwater drone. In other words, it's something that's used to explore the ocean floor and things like this. This has taken place in international waters, according to everybody's definition but Beijing, or most people's other than Beijing. 50 nautical miles southwest of Subic Bay off the Philippines. And this is the United States USS Bowditch. Now, Bowditch, this is a famous thing. The Bowditch was a book, and it was all kinds of technical data on time, sunrise, sunset, all these different things for navigation above all. So the United States, according to a U.S. spokesman, was lawfully conducting a military survey in the waters of the South China Sea, and instead along comes a Chinese vessel and grabs it, and these things are worth $150,000, and the U.S. would like it back. It's clearly marked as U.S. property. Now, many observers put this in the context of a remark by the president-elect where he says, why should we be bound by a one-China policy unless we get concessions on something like trade. And I think this is not the most productive approach. This is not a wise approach, because, of course, you can do a little, a phone call, which essentially might mean very little, right? Might simply be a gesture. But now the quote is now, why do we want to be bound by the one China policy? This is extremely sensitive, right? This is existential for China, right? This is the most important central core interest that they have, is that Taiwan not be independent, declare itself independent, or go under the control of another country. As long as you have the Kuomintang, the KMT, in power in Taipei, they're not going to do that, because they say they're part of China and that they're the government of all of China. But now we have this the DPP, the other party, and they are much more interested in an independent Taiwan. I can remind people, right? You may remember the Hallstein doctrine, right? The Hallstein was the foreign minister of the Federal Republic of Germany, BRD, West Germany, under Adenauer, and he developed this thing called the Alleinvertretung, sole representation. So the Bonn position was, we are Germany, don't have relations with East Berlin, but have them with us. And if you have them with East Berlin, you can't have them with us. So this is a similar thing, right? In other words, where national existence, national unity is at stake. So here we have dangerous incidents with the Chinese in the South China Sea. And I'm not arguing for complete passivity, quite the contrary. But this stuff has got to be carefully prepared, and it's got to be measured. And you can't do the hip shot stuff. It's got to be planned, so you know what you're doing, right? Remember what was said about Lincoln, right? That if Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation 6 months earlier, it would have been a failure. And if he'd issued it 6 months later, it probably would have come too late to influence the military activities of the Civil War, right? So the timing, the sense of where you are, right? This is sort of an art. Now, let's consider now the U.S.-Russian situation. We're having, as I said, the Obama press conference going on in the background. And remember that yesterday in his interview to National Public Radio, Obama had said, if you start meddling in the internal affairs of a country, then that country is likely to react, and we will. Notice, Obama never said retaliation. Never said retaliation. He simply said, we will react. And that wisely, I think, keeps his options completely open, right? You could say, well, he already reacted. He complained about it. He denounced it. So I would not join the nervous Nellies on this. Rather, you could also make the argument that Obama has done far too little. But again, if you're going to do things in this realm, these are not public actions. But let me try to put this in context a little bit more. You may remember Professor Stephen Cohen, once of Princeton, once of NYU. He's on the editorial board of The Nation, and he's a Kremlinologist, a Sovietologist, now retired. And we watched him on one of the cable networks yesterday saying that the situation is absolutely dire between the U.S. and Russia. He thinks that, Professor Cohen thinks that it's about as bad as the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's been saying this now for quite a while. And I have to ask whether this is actually factual, because he has this big thing where he says just the facts, right? Jack Webb, Sergeant Joe Friday. Well, what are the facts? Cohen says that there's a massive NATO buildup on the borders of the Russian Federation. And I have to ask, what is this massive? We're talking about a few hundred troops here and there. We're talking about, I would call them token forces. I don't see the massive part. I don't see how that can be considered to be some kind of overawing presence when the Russian forces, of course, are far more numerous, far more capable, and thanks to the malfeasance of the neocons and others, it may also be the case that quite a few of the Russian weapon systems are better than the ones on the corresponding U.S. side, right? Because they didn't spend all their money in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Iraq, right? That was left to us in the United States, right? With this absolute folly of the neocon and humanitarian bomber foreign policy. So I don't see a massive NATO buildup. And then he said that Russians feel that this is the biggest massing of troops on their border since 1941. Since the attack, right? Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, June 22nd, I think, 1941. I just, Professor Cohen, I don't see this. It's not enough. It is not amassing in that same sense. So we'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to the second hour of World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. And once again, it's the 16th of December, 2016. So, in dialogue now with Professor Stephen Cohen, Emeritus, Princeton Emeritus, NYU, I don't see a massive NATO buildup. I don't see how anybody could believe that this is another Barbarossa by NATO with these essentially token forces. I would say this buildup is about as threatening as the Berlin Brigade used to be. You'll remember there was this U.S. brigade in West Berlin. It was designed to be a tripwire, right? It had no real perspective of militarily resisting the tremendously superior East German and Soviet forces around Berlin. It was simply there to say, if you really want to come and take this, you're going to collide with the U.S. forces, and then you'll have military and political consequences that you don't want. It's deterrence. These are tripwire forces, token forces. So I don't share the idea that this is a prelude to World War III. Now, here's the other thing, is you can look, when you have military forces, you can look at how they're deployed, and you can tell whether those are defensive deployments, a defensive posture, or an offensive posture. And the idea is, well, if it's defensive, they're digging in, they're putting up barbed wire, they're essentially preparing to sit there and see if somebody comes after them. If they're offensive, then they're going to be out in the open field, ready to go at the drop of a hat, right? Everything, timed to go off, right? To, make some kind of a sneak attack. And an observer today with the drones and so forth, you can see that. You can tell the difference. So I think there's an element of confusion in this, right? That it's not enough to say there are certain military forces along some border. Look, it's also clear that Russia is not happy to have these forces, token though they be, along those borders, right? Because we know historically, there's a historical worry about being attacked from the West, right? That's where the attacks have often come from. However, I would look at it differently. I would say it's better to tranquilize these excitable and unstable governments in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, certainly. It's better to offer some reassurances to Poland or Romania. I was not in favor of NATO expansion. I don't like NATO expansion, but this is now a fact. And what you can certainly say that the presence of tripwire forces ought to reassure this part of the world. However, you've also got to combine that with a stern warning to the demagogic politicians of this part of the world saying, we're not going to tolerate any shenanigans. We're not going to have any anti-Russian provocations. You're going to have to call off your Nazi SS commemoration at the various statues in the Baltic states. We know all this stuff. So therefore, cool it, right? Don't rock the boat. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Romania, and so on down the line. So the presence of those tripwire forces ought to tranquilize them. Now, we're also told by Cohen, right, and I think some of this is correct, that so far the U.S. has offered no facts concerning the hack, right? The allegation that the hacks to the Democratic National Committee, Podesta, and others, the allegation that those facts came from Russia is not proven by direct factual evidence. There is no national intelligence estimate, and even that would only be an estimate. However, there is strong circumstantial evidence that the public media coming from Russia in the English language certainly did have a strongly, overwhelmingly pro-Republican ticket bias, and that is beyond doubt. So unfortunately, that policy, which I said at the time was unwise and would lead to trouble, has now given a certain credence to this entire question. Now, here's the other thing. Remember going back to the time of the Maidan, right? Early 2014. So back there in early 2014, remember the famous Victoria Nuland call? Victoria Nuland's phone call was, blankety blank the European Union, and, we want yachts here, and we want some other guy here, and she essentially put together what seemed to amount to a puppet government in Kiev. Well, at that time, there was no, as far as I recall it, there was very little curiosity about how that particular conversation had been tapped into or hacked into. But that capability was obviously there. And then later on, there was another interesting telephone conversation. An official from one of the Baltic states, as I recall, who was telling another Western official that the snipers that had been killing people on the Maidan were actually not from the pro-Russian side, but they were from the other side, right? They were from the the pro-Lvov side. So that also indicated a capability. So there is some kind of a capability there. So those are simply elements of circumstantial evidence. I would repeat again, it was very unwise. It was very unwise even to allow the public media in the English language to assume the position that they did assume. And what we now have, unfortunately, is as a result of this, there is, I think, a lot more hostility and resentment against Russia, quite frankly, which we do not here. I do not plan to share, but that is now a fact. And the job of people in the United States who want to have a rational policy towards Russia has been made more difficult. The other difference I have with Cohen is that Cohen seems to support Trump, I guess, and he's a supporter of the Republican ticket, as far as I discern from these statements. Maybe he doesn't actually come out and say it, but that seems to be the idea, that he saw this as a peace candidacy. So I would say that he's attempting to perhaps arrange the facts around the that he wants. Cohen, it seems to think that the new Republican administration will kick out the neocons completely. He mentioned Newland, of course. We mentioned Newland during the course of the week. Well, I think that this argument is not as conclusive as he claims that he wants it to be. Now, the question, was Italian Prime Minister Renzi ousted by a Russian hacking campaign? And he finds that not plausible. I guess it does. That argument has a lot of problems because at one of the recent meetings of the European Union in mid-October, it was Renzi who came out and said that Italy does not want any more sanctions against Russia, and especially does not want them on the basis of what's happening in Aleppo. So, that does not make sense. But maybe there are some other things that are more pertinent. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. So please remember, time to go to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, and subscribe Monday through Thursday, 1 hour available in the evening. So, Renzi, I don't think this makes any sense. Now, there are at least claims that some kind of hacking is going on vis-a-vis Germany. And this would be an article here from various sources. There are some people in Germany who accuse Russia of waging cyber war against Germany. And this involves the APT-28 Fancy Bear hacking group. I think according to the New York Times, that's the GRU military intelligence hacking group. There was a breakdown recently of 700,000 routers used by Deutsche Telekom for computer cybernetic services. There's no link, but there is the wondering, who did that or what happened. Merkel last year said cyber attacks or hybrid conflicts, as they are known in Russian doctrine, are now part of daily life, and we must learn to cope with them. And also notice here, there's no proof, right? But there's an assertion, and there is some probably circumstantial evidence. Now, we got to learn to know who some of these guys are. In Germany, they of course have two important agencies. One is the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, German Information Service, foreign intelligence primarily. This is Pullach near Munich. It's the old Gehlen organization, right? And so here it is. The current head of it, Bruno Kahl, Kahl. And then we have the Bundesamt für Verfassungsschutz, Federal Office for the Defense of the Constitution, Domestic Intelligence, Hans-Georg Maassen, Maassen, and they have both talked about Russian cyber activity in Germany. Karl says to the Süddeutsche Zeitung of Munich, quote, there are findings that cyber attacks take place which have no other meaning than to create public uncertainty. There is a kind of pressure on public discourse and democracy which is unacceptable. Attribution to a state actor is technically difficult, but there is some evidence that it is at least tolerated or desired by the state, right, by the nation state in question. And the Verfassungsschutz says, since the start of the Ukraine crisis, Germany, Federal Republic, BRD, has seen a significant increase in Russian propaganda and disinformation campaigns in Germany. This reflects an enormous use of financial resources on Russia's part. This is him. They're talking about false flags, right? And an unseen methodology in campaigns. So some of these statements are pretty clear in talking about Russia. Now, again, we would like to see the proof, but I don't think you can simply say that any of this speculation is simply baseless. Maybe we ought to just think about what could it be, right? What could the goal be? According to some, it would be to cause chaos in an election, to discredit the idea of elections, right? Say to discredit U.S. electoral processes and U.S. democracy. Another view of it is it's a vendetta against Hillary Clinton because she did notoriously interfere in Russian internal affairs, right? And we got to realize there's this tradition of color revolutions, and about this we should ask former Ambassador Michael McFaul, who is now on TV quite a bit. So what do we have to look for here? Further causes, though. One cause, I think, given the animus against NATO, which is understandable, it's to break up NATO. It's to try to promote leaders or others who don't like NATO. And then there's this question about social tensions. And again, I think you have to go back to a longer view of Russian foreign policy and indeed Soviet foreign policy. And if you go back to the 1920s, late 1920s especially, and early 1930s, the Executive Committee of the Communist International, I think starting under Bukharin, but then continuing under Zinoviev and others, espoused the theory of social fascism, that the enemy, they said to the communist parties, the enemy is not, as it might seem, the fascist movements. No. The real problem are the social fascists, and those would be the social democrats and the unions that are associated with them. And I hope I'm not mistaken when I cite Adam Ulam, U-L-A-M. Adam Ulam was a scholar, and I guess his most influential book is his book on Soviet foreign policy, right? Sort of pre-1975, right? Going all the way back to the beginning. And his idea was that the Soviet foreign policy tried to increase social tensions, right? To increase social conflicts inside what were then the capitalist countries, right? The adversary capitalist countries, and tried to proceed there. Let's just maybe try to illustrate that from another point of view. The Communist International said that they operated on two levels. They said, first of all, we have peaceful coexistence. So peaceful coexistence pertains to the direct relations among governments. But then there is what they called proletarian internationalism, and that means trying to promote the revolution, and that is not so friendly, right? And that is something that is done underground or surreptitiously or in other ways. It includes propaganda, agitation and propaganda, and it's supposed to lead to political conflicts, and it's supposed to lead to the revolution. So there are two levels of this, and I think that might also point a way to a solution. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, urging you once again in the Christmas season, need a gift? Well, AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. That's the way to treat yourself and others to this analysis 4 additional days per week. That is to say, Monday through Thursday. So I've tried to argue there's a big difference between international relations and domestic affairs, right? It sort of mirrors this thing about peaceful coexistence among governments, but then they say there should be proletarian internationalism below the radar, and that should lead to the revolution. So these cannot be totally separated, but they can be somewhat separated. So why don't we look at it like this? We want cooperation with Russia, yes, indeed. And this especially is a matter of international affairs. It is a tragedy that the United States has made such poor bets in places like Syria, betting on these terrorist rebels. What is that supposed to be all about? It is pointless. If you put all your chips on such weak, unreliable, treacherous, crazy players, well, you're going to have a bad result. And you got nobody to thank for that but yourself. So why not take a constructive approach, be rational, put aside this absurd Russophobia, and begin to have a rational and productive foreign policy, cooperate against international terrorism. Is there something wrong with that? Now, obviously there are some people in the U.S. government who would say, no, various terrorist organizations are valuable assets that we probably need to use in the future against adversaries. Put this aside. Have you learned nothing from the whole, at least from the 9/11 cover story, right? If you've accepted the 9/11 cover story, you ought to say that Afghanistan was intolerable because Al-Qaeda was there. So similarly, right? Who do you think was operating in Aleppo and Idlib? It was Al-Qaeda. So you should be against that. And we could multiply this for other parts of the world. However, at the same time, you cannot allow foreign countries to meddle so egregiously in the domestic affairs. Now, again, proof is needed. And the Russian government today said, put up or shut up. Right? The U.S. government should either provide proof about Russian hacking or shut up. Okay, fair enough. Obama, I did see the beginning of Obama's press conference. He said that he told Putin in one of the Asian summits in September that it was, that Russia should stop intervening in the U.S. political process. And Obama said, indeed, after that point, there were no more Russian hacks. So he said this intervention was successful. The problem being that the hack into the Democratic National Committee and probably the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which also was penetrated, that those were already, that loot had already been shipped out and presumably given to WikiLeaks and the others. So he says it worked. Fine. And we have to see, what's going on now. The veteran intelligence professionals for sanity have a theory that it's not hacking. This was not hacking, but leaking. And I'm just wondering, the leaking part, I'm wondering whether that is this official of the Democratic National Committee who succumbed to a violent incident on Capitol Hill. I don't know that, so let's not jump to any conclusions on that. On the other hand, we would have to look, and I will look at the proof, right? So you want proof. Well, if you want proof from one group, then you probably want proof from this group too. And we'll have to try to evaluate the quality of the evidence, right? So their conclusion is the emails were leaked by an insider, as was the case with Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. Such an insider could be anyone in a government department or agency with access to NSA databases, or perhaps someone within the DNC. So I don't know how factual, how specific that all is. So I think this is where we are left. Now, I have to do the third prong. Well, you're probably waiting. Where's the third prong? The third prong, the third threat to world peace in 2016, right? We discussed this question of the war with Iran, or a renewed conflict with Iran, or extreme tension with Iran, and the personnel choices seem to go in that direction. And of course, there was this polemic against the Iran nuclear deal. We're very much in favor of the Iran nuclear deal, right? The word that we need to hear more of is war avoidance. But again, war avoidance does not preclude talking about and investigating what's going on in one's own domestic political sphere if you think that there have been undue interferences. Remember, the intervention in the internal affairs of sovereign states is inadmissible, UN Charter. We have the Beijing story that these comments about the one China policy seem to be correlated with this naval incident in the South China Sea. And we've got the new ambassador to Israel, right? This would be Mr. Friedman. Mr. Friedman is somebody who does not agree with the two-state solution. He does not think that there should be a Palestinian state. He seems to think that, that that's just not a proposal. And his story is, his profile is that he's associated with fundraising and support for Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, which we have to point out, from a strict international law position under the UN and until recently under the State Department too, those are also inadmissible. It's funny, on the France 24 weekly discussion, they were quite focused on this Israeli ambassador question, and that if you do this, such an ambassador in Israel, it's also somebody who says he wants the U.S. embassy to be moved to Jerusalem, right, the eternal capital of Israel. And of course, that's not the State Department position. And that would, if you're talking about all of Jerusalem, that would also, unfortunately, reflect, territorial transfers not sanctioned under the UN regime, because there's no peace settlement. So, the France 24 people say, this looks like it's going to be trouble for somebody like the Jordanian government, or the Saudis and the Gulf monarchies are likely to respond angrily to that. So in other words, you're generating some crisis byproducts here, even as you're doing this stuff. So those would be the three prongs, right? Iran, China, and possibly the Middle East. The Middle East probably looking something like a new intifada or something like this. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley in Washington, D.C. on the 16th of December. Now, on our daily program, we've been going through this question of the new age of oligarchy. This actually came up on the France 24 news debates, that, what you seem to see is the ascendancy of oligarchs once again in many parts of the world. And what are the implications? In terms of the roots of the U.S.-Russian tension, hostility, I guess at some level, although not at the level of individuals, not in my experience anyway, having been in Russia a couple of times in the first half of last year, I found tremendous goodwill, specifically towards Americans, and curiosity by Russian average people. There was a there's a highway. Well, it's too complicated to tell, but people are you're very welcome. I'd come into a restaurant and they're glad to see you. Here's what we'd have to talk about. There are two main things, with some overlays in each case, but two basic things. One is economic. You have to remember that when the Soviet Union came to an end, the planned economy was abolished, and you had then the liberalization or the freeing up of prices. Prices had been controlled. There was a series of privatizations. The privatizations went badly because the typical form of the privatization was what you have to call a nomenclatura privatization. That is to say, the existing oligarchy inside the Soviet Communist Party, including in the republics, the 15 Union republics, those oligarchs, right, that nomenclatura, because that's what that means, oligarchy, they decided to privatize the things that they were managing. You could have been managing a factory with 50,000 workers, and you were the Communist Party appointee to be the manager. At a certain point, the manager says, "Guess what? I own this. I'm privatizing it." And this issue is still there, I would say, in Russia. But the main problem that went on, above and beyond that, was the shock therapy that prices were allowed to run wild. There was actual hyperinflation, I think about 1,500% or more during 1991 to 1992. And this was done under the auspices surely of the International Monetary Fund, but also of economists coming from the U.S. and the U.S. Treasury. Larry Summers played quite a role in this. So the idea was to have a market economy, but it was really shock therapy, and this was obvious folly. For Russia, it was a very bad idea to go to this wild capitalism. Would have been much better to take a social democratic model or a New Deal model, heavily regulated, ample provision for a social safety net. That was not done. So, as we read in this interesting book, The Tragedy of Russia's Reforms, Market Bolshevism Against Democracy by Redaway and Glinsky, we see that by the fall of 1997, and again, you got to remember there were two points in the 1990s where everything went wrong. One was what I just mentioned, the hyperinflation of 91-92, 1,500%. Anybody with savings was wiped out, and a lot of people had savings because you couldn't buy anything. So the only hope was to save it, and maybe you thought you were going to buy stock in a nationalized company. No, you were not. So what happened, and then in 1998, in the Asian contagion in general, the Russian state defaulted on the so-called GKO, right, the state bonds, right, treasury bills. They defaulted, national bankruptcy, and another banking panic, and everybody was wiped out. So wiped out twice. People say that the German political system in the 1920s was ruined really by the Weimar hyperinflation of 1923 when the middle class was wiped out. And after that, they had only resentment. Hey, same thing in Russia, except it happened twice, 92 and 98. Now, how did that then work? By 1997, we read, the Yeltsin government, right, Yeltsin being a joint production of the Russian oligarchs, especially in his second term after 1996, the Russian oligarchs, and the U.S. and the foreign interests. But by 1997, we read, the Yeltsin government recognized that the attempt by the Kremlin to use Russian nationalism as a vehicle for nation building in the Russian Federation, now we're talking, and as an ideological counterweight to the left-wing opposition, this attempt had run into a dead end. The Yeltsin regime had to dump both statist nationalism, in other words, our Russian Federation as a state, and ethnocratic nationalism, right, based on national feeling. And since the Yeltsin government by this point is devoid of any democratic or reformist credibility, it found itself in an ideological void. And this void was filled by pervasive anti-Americanism. And this was facilitated by the following things. The United States gave rather open public support to Anatoly Chubais. Chubais was the privatizing director, right? He presided over this nomenclatura privatization. U.S., known as the redhead, right? You'll see him. He's got red hair. U.S. support for the much-hated Chubais was open. There was NATO expansion, and there was NATO's bombing of the Orthodox Serbs, right? Serbia. That would be the spring of 1999. So this anti-Americanism impacted even the most liberal and Western-minded circles of Russian society. The government hardly needed to devise a national patriotic ideology of its own because it could credibly dismiss all Western criticism, say, of the Russian mafia or of Yeltsin's oligarchical rule, as simply another attempt to victimize Russia as a nation. And then the authors go on to say, what may be decisive in the future is whether or not a more sophisticated policy can be developed by the United States and its allies that would dispel this Russian mistrust and help Russians to focus more sharply on the grave domestic problems that made Russia's international stature so shaky, so vulnerable in the first place. To sum up the attempts, and this is up to about 2000, to sum up, every attempt to rally a progressive anti-shock therapy, it means anti-austerity, an anti-oligarchical coalition under the banner of Russian nationalism